Hello, everybody. Welcome to a special post-news update. I'm John Pollock, along with Wai Ting, on a Thursday. How are you, Wai?
Not bad, John. We had a rare Wednesday off, of course, due to AEW Dynamite's postponement. But how did you spend it?
On Wednesday, I began thinking to myself that if I could totally adapt to this schedule where Friday nights would be like your Friday is a write-off as is in our current schedule. So I would not mind throwing up AEW programming on Friday night, and you just like the night's a write-off anyway in exchange for Wednesday, the breather in the middle of the week. Unfortunately, we are not getting that at all come this summer because we are not only keeping our Wednesday schedule, but we are tacking on another hour of programming on Friday night. So I'm going to I enjoyed Wednesday night, just not having wrestling to watch as I will next week. But what I did do with my time was later on Wednesday night, I watched the Mike Tyson documentary that aired. The first part aired on on ABC this past weekend.
Interesting. Okay, this is a new one.
Yeah, it's a brand new one. Pretty in-depth interview, or pretty in-depth documentary. But all, as I'm recalling it now, I think it's all archived interview clips with Mike Tyson and no up-to-date ones. But there are no shortage of people that are interviewed on this. I enjoyed it quite a lot. It ends part one. Ends right after he loses the title to Buster Douglas in April of 1990. And then the teaser for part two is you go into the whole rape case and everything of essentially we have watched the rise of him to this unbelievable superstar that is worth millions and millions of dollars. And now the cracks are beginning to form. His home life is falling apart. Now he's suffered this loss to Buster Douglas, and we're about to watch the decline throughout the 90s.
Wow, it's fascinating. There's obviously a lot to that story. So, do you know? So, I guess it's not necessarily authorized or unauthorized if he's not participating in it.
I don't know. I'm just trying to recall that I'm pretty sure all the interview clips are archived, but I believe Tyson is actually interviewed. So I think he is associated with this. So someone will likely chime in that has followed this closer. But I do believe Tyson has an involvement in this.
Cool.
What did you do with your Wednesday?
Man, I just relaxed. Like, I don't even think we turned the TV on. It was just, I guess, like taking care of errands. I had a suit fitting yesterday for a wedding that, we'll have to update a lot of people, our private guests about, but it's looking like it's not happening the way that we had initially wanted to with current restrictions. So it's just having to deal with a lot of that. And then, yeah, just kind of relaxed and enjoyed the night off.
Well, we're going to go into a bunch of news because since we talked on Monday, a few things have gone down. And we'll start off with the broadcast situation in WWE. So several items to all of this. Number one, Adnan Virk is out, with the WWE announcing that the sides have mutually agreed to part ways after 6 weeks of Adnan Virk as the voice of Raw. Replacing him will be former Bellator and UFC commentator Jimmy Smith, and just reported earlier today by Fightful.com is that among the releases this week includes Tom Phillips. So a lot there, Way. First of all, the Adnan Virk experiment, certainly one that did not pan out. Were you at all surprised that the WWE made such a decision after 6 weeks? I mean, that is a pretty... typically, they do let these things play out. And the fact that it was so short-lived, it very much was, I would say a little surprising it was so early that they made this decision.
Yeah, it was mainly, I think, the speed in which they, basically aborted this experiment that was probably the only surprising part of all this. I will say it feels like he had kind of settled into some sort of groove, if you want to call it that obviously wasn't great, but at least was tolerable. And I could have seen them sticking with Adnan Virk for at least, a few more months, if not even longer than that, because he just, it wasn't to the point where I think his commentary was offensive. Like I found him, eventually I just kind of started to tune him out. And, for all the benefit that you would assume that they hired him for in the first place, that being, I suppose, some sort of a bit of notoriety in a mainstream sports world, you would assume that they were happy enough, but clearly not.
They're going with Jimmy Smith. That was a surprising name for me, given, I think, the exact same criticisms you would have of Adnan Virk. And just going through this, I mean, they're two different broadcasters. I get that. But with Jimmy Smith, I mean, you have the same situation of someone who admittedly, he followed wrestling when he was young, but by 1990 stated like he was completely out of pro wrestling up until getting this phone call from Michael Cole about the potential of auditioning for WWE. And I mean, since then, he said that he has not missed a second of WWE programming. He certainly comes across, and this, I think, would be very evident if I was a big fan of his work, particularly in Bellator, where he was calling weekly shows fanatic when it comes to research and preparation, which I don't doubt he is applying here. But, this is certainly, I think you can see a lot of the same potential problems as you just went through with Adnan Virk. However, for that very reason, I see Jimmy Smith probably having a lot more leeway, because I think if you go through 6 weeks of this and you have the same outcome, it kind of reflects much more on WWE than it does either of the broadcasters.
Sure, certainly. And I have to imagine that they would at least be somewhat conscious of like that, the fact that this is taking as big of a risk. I would say, to me, on the surface, it seems like a bit less of a risk, because I guess you are talking about somebody with combat sports, with more direct combat sports play-by-play experience, even though he was
not play-by-play way. I mean, he was in an analyst position. He's doing play-by-play on Raw, which is not a position that he had.
Yeah, it is certainly different, but I would say I have a bit more faith in this transition than maybe somebody coming from like baseball, or somebody coming from a sport that really has nothing to do with pro wrestling or the flow of pro wrestling at all. But we'll see. My optimism is a little bit higher, but probably still not that high that we have found Raw's permanent, play-by-play commentator. It's an indicator that they are really dead set on people from the outside world, people with no pro wrestling experience, or at least people who, they value their experience outside of the wrestling world a lot more than, people who do have that, because there are a lot of great pro wrestling announcers out there that are untapped, but, maybe don't have the public cachet as even somebody like a Jimmy Smith.
Well, that's certainly, I think, a factor in this. For me, after you've gone through this, they went through an experiment with Adnan Virk. It did not work out. To me, I would have gone with just a safe pick. And that, for me, would have been Vic Joseph that you put in there. And even if your long-term strategy is like, Jimmy Smith conveyed that his audition went really well and they were very happy with him. And the proof will be what you hear on Monday. If that is the case and you see this person as someone to develop, I would assign him to something like an NXT, which is still a high profile spot. But number one, it's not the spotlight of Raw. Number two, it is not being produced by Vince McMahon. Number three, the NXT, not across the board, but I think the style that he would be put in a position to call would be much more adaptable for his background. When you look at the options of your Kyle O'Reillys, your Pete Dunnes, Kushidas, that even a Karrion Kross, and drawing from those influences that I think would be an easier bridge for him, as opposed to going right into the deep end, and this guy is going to be reacting to Lily and Alexa Bliss.
Well, and, that's just a funny notion to have to think, and he's gonna have to cross that bridge probably on Monday this coming week. But unfortunately, even though I think on the surface that sounds like a great idea, like ultimately they want somebody of that quote unquote, brand value, name value to be attached to their Raw show, their flagship show, or at least, one of their flagship shows.
And I get that way, but like, and I'm not, this isn't a like any disrespect, but I don't think Jimmy Smith is like that name that is like, he is not of the level of notoriety of an Adnan Virk. Nowhere near that.
Yeah, sure. But nonetheless, I listen, your guess is as good as mine. I think he is simply somebody who happens to be in that system right now. They need a name. And hey, who's that guy who used to do the MMA on that other channel? Okay, well let's give him a shot. And he worked.
Who's a candidate that if you were looking for all those things is his former broadcast partner Sean Wheelock, who was and is like followed wrestling from a young age in Kansas City and would be able to do it seamlessly and has done pro wrestling in the past.
Well, for whatever reason, his name was not on their radar, and he's not among the choices. It really is quite amazing when you think about this like billion-dollar company and like the people that they really have to choose from. They could choose from anybody, but yet it's like they consistently make the bad decisions. And again, we have to give Jimmy Smith a chance because
that's right. We haven't heard him at all beyond the pre-shows. Like you have to go into it open-minded. He might impress everyone on Monday. Like you can't make a judgment until, and honestly, even after one episode, I said the same with Adnan Virk. I don't like, you need several weeks.
6 weeks. 6 weeks.
Well, apparently 6. 6 is the magic number you need. And then you can render a decision on someone's fate.
Yeah,
Jimmy Smith. If you did hear him on his Instagram live, he talked about a lot of this stuff, and was even one of the questions was he was like asked about. I guess the question was something to the effect of, "Do you get more than 1 week?" And he was just like, "I think I've got to get at least more than 1 week." So I mean, like, I think he's going into this with like the right mindset.
I hope these Instagram lives continue after every Raw, where he just has like this sort of like, post-production meeting with the audience. And I mean, I am kind of like speaking in jest a little bit, but I also feel like much of this will come down to what the audience's feeling is towards his commentary. And I actually feel like sort of that transparent dialogue of him saying, I could have done better here and better here. That's actually not such a bad thing. So I hope he keeps that open discourse with the public.
Earlier this week, a lot of cuts at WWE, essentially consolidating several departments. So what it looks to be is that the television department, its advanced media section, and WWE Studios will now be kind of under this umbrella as WWE Media, run by Kevin Dunn. Conversely, it looks like all of the international offices are going to be overseen by Nick Khan, and this resulted in many cuts cited as redundancy, including some notable executives that have been reported on from WrestleNomics, Fightful, PW Insider. And so, I mean, just looking at it, that this is, I think especially what people were looking at was as you're going into this Peacock deal, and one of the big talking points from the company executives, including Stephanie McMahon, has been, well, this deal allows us to get away from the technical aspect and being in that competitive field on the tech side of things, and we can focus on content creation, which is our strength. And so it might be a curious decision when you see that you are getting rid of people that are involved in that aspect of your business. But it's also like you are getting this guaranteed amount every year from Peacock. And I guess they viewed some of those roles as being, quote unquote, redundant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. These are sort of factors of, I guess, these sort of big overarching deals that we don't really think about. But, always unfortunate to hear people losing their work. Not even necessarily, people in sort of these like executive positions, but many of the smaller people, who just pretty much hold these regular jobs that we'll probably never really get to hear about. But, it encompasses a lot of divisions. And yeah, if you do kind of understand it. I mean, it just seems to be, it happens all the time, on consolidation of what they seem to determine as sort of a unnecessary roles at this point.
Yeah, and creating just like a leaner job set within the company. And, it's been interesting to watch on the WWE Network that some of these digital projects that they put out, you're starting to see credit rolls at the end. And I think that's a welcome change, because everyone raves when WWE Network puts out some of these specials, and a lot of the names, like, the average person is not going to be familiar with who is putting these together. And, those are some of the names that are likely, thrown into these cuts that you're not familiar with, but you probably enjoyed their work in some form or fashion.
Mm-hmm. It'll be interesting to see, if we see any effects in terms of quality or in terms of like even sort of
output,
editorial direction. Of a lot of these things. And in particular, I'm thinking about, more so documentary series that the WWE studios would have had a hand in, such as, these A&E documentaries, the upcoming Vince McMahon documentary, which I would assume would be near completion, or, at least, maybe past the stages of any sort of like outside interference by this point. But that's really what I'm curious about. And I would hope not. I think the more independent voices you have, the better, rather than, I feel like this news, I don't think Kevin Dunn has like necessarily the best public reputation at this point amongst the diehard wrestling fans, and to have him kind of at the helm of everything, or at least like being the sole voice, or of one of the bigger voices, it might be something that might not be met with that much, fanfare.
Raw on Monday did 1,620,000 viewers, a 0.45 in the demo, that coming from PW Torch, who also noted NXT doing 698,000 viewers and a 0.13 in the demo. So for NXT, viewership was almost similar to last week, but the demo, 0.13 is not a great number. Both, of course, are going against the NBA playoffs, which is going to be taking out a chunk of your audience. In Canada, Raw ended up doing 178,000 viewers. So while it was down, I would say that number, all things considered, held up fairly well, considering that the Leafs-Canadiens game did over 3.3 million viewers on Monday night going against it. So those are your ratings notes. I guess I would say a bit disappointing, considering you had built up this Karrion Kross Finn Balor rematch, which was a very strong match, but it was not able to spike your viewership in any way.
Yeah, so, these numbers seem to, be reflective of where NXT used to be. So if you're NXT, how would you assess the move to Tuesdays right now?
Well, for the month of May, so we have a whole month here of unopposed Tuesdays, they're averaging 714,000 viewers and a 0.16 in the demo. So you're seeing, compared to when you did have AEW competition, it's up, but not by any sizable amount. So I would look at that as it's a bit of a... I can't say I am stunned, because I didn't think that NXT was going to get the same bump as AEW would unopposed. And I think that coming up, the next 2 months are going to be hard to gauge, because you're going to have this, you're going to have the playoffs that in theory should only become that much tougher and larger audiences that you're competing against. So I would say that the move to NXT, I think long term, this is going to be a help for NXT. I think the shows have been better without having the competition on the other channel, but the numbers have not swelled to any meaningful degree without AEW.
The other thing is that, we have, at least in my opinion, seen a bit more of an awareness of NXT on Raw. At least throughout the commercial breaks, being constantly, told, hey, this is the main event coming up on the very next day. We don't even have to wait the next day. And it hasn't necessarily paid off in terms of added viewership for NXT. So what, could they be doing more in that sense? Or do you think there's only so much of an appetite for wrestling between Monday and Tuesday?
Yeah, I think that you can't say that they are utilizing that audience of 1.8 million viewers on Monday nights to drive people to NXT. I think you have to really be paying attention to catch those promos. I agree, like they have I think they have tried, especially with the cage match promos that they had last week with Gargano and Bronson Reed. I think there's more of an awareness of it, but it's not as though it's a hard push that they make on Raw. That said, I don't think that's going to be the difference either of like 100,000 viewers. So, I mean, it comes down to me of any of these NXT stars really catching fire. I think that it's a show that it's a pretty enjoyable show most weeks, but I don't know if they have been able to establish these shows as must see, even when you have a big rematch from your last TakeOver special that they spent several weeks building up. It doesn't appear that even that was enough of a draw to people. Like it's got its baked in audience, and it's going to be very hard to spike that number unless you have something very, very special. And typically what we've seen over the last year is what has added to NXT are either doing a big takeover special or like a theme show like a Halloween Havoc, that I think the name very much helped that as well.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also in this case maybe, the stock of somebody like a Karrion Kross, who if you're just watching Raw, you really would have no awareness of at all. Even if you're an NXT fan, it's like, he's still I would say under the cusp of like sort of quote unquote like superstardom, even on an NXT basis.
So we haven't discussed this yet, but for a performer in John Cena, who one of his biggest attributes, I would say, has been this guy has been as controversy free as you're going to find. He has really found himself in this situation where he has received so much backlash for this interview he recently did, where he was speaking in Mandarin and noting that the first country that F9 is going to be playing in would be Taiwan. And this led to unbelievable backlash in China that does not recognize Taiwan as an independent country. And a follow-up apology video by John Cena, also delivered in Mandarin, profusely apologizing for this error in judgment. And it's led to great unrest among those that feel that John Cena capitulated to this and apologized over something that he shouldn't have. So it seems like he just seems like this has been a very significant story that John Cena has found himself in.
Certainly, yeah. So, my views on this as soon as it came out was, I mean, I certainly looked as deep into the story as I could, and seeing that everything that he was saying was in Mandarin. The first thing I feel that's necessary is that we have to remember that this man is communicating all of this in a language that is not his first language. Even though he is incredibly fluent, far more fluent than I will ever be in Mandarin, I think we have to recognize that his vocabulary is still very limited when it comes to this language. So can you imagine John, you having to go out to Japan to do media for post wrestling and then saying something offensive in that language to those people without realizing that you have, and then trying to have to come up with an apology at the same time. So in that sense, I have sympathy for this situation for him. It is incredibly sad that, of course, he feels the need to make that sort of apology over something like that should be a completely accepted fact by everybody. Unfortunately, this is a topic that is very sensitive in China, who holds nationalism in very high regard, and any sort of form of separatism is seen as almost a treasonous discussion. So here's John Cena, you have to remember, somebody who not only is one of his attributes, somebody who seems to be, free of political, commentary. He's also somebody who speaks Mandarin, and I have no doubt that was probably one of the decisions behind, his hiring for F9, or at the very least, one of his main features is that he could help promote this film in China. Not only did he manage to piss off the Chinese audience, but in trying to apologize to the Chinese audience, which is what I think he was trying to do first and foremost, not really sort of yeah, he said, I'm sorry. But I also feel I don't think he can get into deep commentary in Mandarin when talking about Taiwan, if he even wanted to. But secondly, I think at that point he was just thinking, "Oh shit, I really pissed off China. People who have employed me for this film aren't going to be happy about that. Let me send this thing on Weibo that'll try to fix it." But in doing that, he just pissed off the rest of the world. So he's kind of like turned the situation from bad to worse. And to me, it's an indicator of.
Sorry.
To me, it's an indicator of just like the very kind of sensitivity of maybe the Chinese audience when it comes to topics like this. It's also an indicator of the difficulty in trying to appease like politics at the same time as trying to cater, our entertainment to another market. There are going to be, if anything, like this whole thing has kind of brought about like the topic of Taiwan up, to a larger audience, and has made people maybe a bit more aware of the situation. But we talk about we're talking about China a whole lot now when it comes to our entertainment, with like everything going on with Chloe Zhao and Shang-Chi with Marvel. And it's a discussion that I think continues to it's going to be a lot bigger. Can Hollywood be okay accepting Chinese money while, disagreeing with their politics? I don't know if you can really have one without the other. And to me, this is an example of that. To me, John Cena is not somebody who we count on for any sort of political commentary. He, to me, is just a company man right now trying to do damage control. And it's really blown up in his face.
Yeah, I mean, this guy has been, if there's one thing you can say about John Cena, is that he is always very careful. And I think that's a huge selling feature for John Cena. This is a very safe celebrity to be in business with. If you are a film studio, if you are WWE, like any endorsement, John Cena, that is kind of his brand. So, like, I am 100% sure that he had no idea what he was stepping into, or went in there with any intent to, this is a guy that just chose the wrong word. I don't think this is anywhere of a controversy if he had just said the first place that this is going to air in is Taiwan. But afterward, I think a lot of people were disappointed. And from some of the limited commentary I've seen on this, it seems that this not only upset kind of a worldwide audience that he ended up rendering this apology, but from the perspective of the Chinese, is that it's not as though he went very in depth to denounce it either. So it's like it wasn't enough of an apology, yet it was enough of an apology to upset people. Cena did it. So he's just in a terrible place. And you're also looking at, this is a guy that, yes, there's probably a quite a degree of self-preservation in terms of issuing this apology to try and for his own brand. But also, you're talking about a movie franchise that if you are compromising its distribution, it's probably impacting a lot of people beyond John Cena. And this is a guy that is going to put that mindset first. It's a terrible situation he found himself in, but it puts a spotlight on the delicate reaction of just something to that degree when you're talking about different parts of the world that are not going to be taking to it so kindly.
Yeah. And if I'm John Cena, I'm not doing any more press in Mandarin. All I'm saying is ni hao, ni hao. I'm pretending I've got very little Mandarin speaking.
Well, I read this thought, and I'd be curious your thought. If the exact same wording is done by John Cena, but he's stating it in English, do you think it's any different because it was in Mandarin that it had kind of the impact?
And you mean the second statement, his apology, or the first one?
The first one. If he had been doing English media and mentioned Taiwan as a country, do you think that it's the same blowback effect?
I'm not aware of John Cena's level of understanding of that whole situation, so he could very well have said country without understanding the ramifications.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a different question. But if he had said place, I would agree with you that this would not be an issue.
Yeah, so it's just Yeah, that's kind of the story. Like, do you think long term, like this is going to impact John Cena moving forward? Do you think that this is a story that will dissolve in the weeks to come?
I largely feel like it will dissolve, but it's hard to say like what China's practices are like. Every year they only allow a certain number of American films to be crossed over in order to make money at their box office. And I imagine F9 is still going to be one of those because it's such a big franchise. And I don't think this really hurts it. And I don't think like Cena is the type who I think is so, uncontroversial that he'll step out of the spotlight long enough for this to not be a bit of an issue. But will it linger in North America or like in the Western world that, hey, his name is now sort of attached to this, like, because on the surface, it does not look good. All these articles of John Cena apologizing in Mandarin and professing his love of China, which, by the way, is an absolutely fine statement to say. I think we can, we have to be able to separate somebody's love for the people of a country or simply the country itself without him necessarily pledging allegiance to the Chinese Communist Party. Like, these are separate things, and I feel like that's what John Cena's intent is. And I think that's totally fine, but certainly when you read the headline, John Cena apologizes in Chinese and professes his love for China, it doesn't read that well. So will this follow him? I mean, I don't think so. I think the news cycle moves fast, and this is not like sort of in my opinion, like an irredeemable act, but I could be wrong.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to wrap things up for this post-news update. But just to give everyone a heads up, we do have the new British Wrestling Experience, offshoot of the British Wrestling Experience. Bushby and Thompson's Wrestling Adventure is up now with the two, Martin Bushby, Andrew Thompson, reviewing Beyond the Mat, along with special guest Andy Quilden of Rev Pro, chatting about the documentary, and Andy also discussing Will Ospreay, his status with Rev Pro, so a bit of a update on that front. And then Friday night, we are going to be back midnight Eastern with a special rewind, a Dyna-Down, as Wai and I review Dynamite and SmackDown together Friday night at midnight for all patrons. All that, plus our review of The Dissident that drops for patrons on Friday at postwrestlingcafe.com as we head into Double or Nothing weekend, Way. No shortage.
Lots coming out. We might have taken the evening off yesterday, but we are going to make up for it in more ways than one on over the weekend. So please join us, everybody, at postwrestlingcafe.com.
And that's going to wrap it up. Thanks to everybody for checking out this post-news update, and we will speak with you Friday.